I will kick us off with some questions, and then toward the end, we'll open it up for some audience questions. So to my left is Mandy Smithberger. Mandy is the director of the Strauss Military Reform Project at the Project on Government Oversight, former National Security Policy Advisor to Representative Jackie Speer, and she also previously served as an analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency and U.S. Central Command. And then we will go to her left, and Moshe Schwartz, Executive Director of the Section 809 panel right now. He's on detail from his position as a specialist in defense acquisitions at the Congressional Research Service. He has written numerous reports and testified before Congress on the acquisition of major defense programs. His temporary assignments include serving as a senior advisor to the Commission on Wartime Contracting in Iraq and Afghanistan, and as an advisor at ISAF headquarters in Afghanistan. He previously served also as a senior analyst at the GAO and an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, New York. Thank you for joining us. I thought maybe we'd kick off the panel today by starting with talking about what the sort of forecast looks like for Congress. What should we expect out of Capitol Hill this year relating to defense acquisition, things that might affect the defense industry? Mandy, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So today, Chairman Thornberry of the Armed Services Committee just introduced new legislation. So he's still very much engaged on working on acquisition reform issues. Some of the things that we see emphasis on is looking at how the department does commercial buying. Let's see. Can you hear me better now? Sorry. Also looking at making some changes to what authorities the Defense Contract Audit Agency is going to have. From the perspective of the Project on Government Oversight, we get a little bit concerned when we see independent oversight being undermined, particularly some efforts to have outside auditors kind of do that audit work, where it might be harder to actually enforce those decisions. And then Chairman McCain has also shown over his whole career a lot of interest in acquisition reform issues. There were a lot of changes that happened in the last National Defense Authorization Act, but I would anticipate more as well.
Sure. I guess it's my turn, huh?
Yep.
So before I start, just a couple of things. One is, any comments I make is more on behalf of the 809 panel and not the Congressional Research Service. And if it's my opinion, I'll let you know. If there's something that you want to quote that I say, please make sure to spell my name correctly. That's Mandy, M-A-N-D-I, Smithberger. Okay. So the question is, what can we expect from Congress in the area of defense acquisition reform over the next year or even a little bit beyond that?
Yep.
So I think there are some very interesting questions in that area. One question is, well, we actually don't have any question as to what the House is considering because that bill dropped today, the draft. And as many of you know, what the House has done, the House Armed Services Committee has done in recent years, is they drop a bill so they have some comment period so they can get feedback, so then they can roll that into the NDAA. So the assumption would be that there will be some feedback, there might be some modifications, but that in general is the construct of where they're looking to go for an NDAA. On the Senate side, as Mandy pointed out, there has, I guess the word would be, some activism in Title VIII, which is the acquisition title for the NDAA and some other areas. They've been incredibly active, including changing the wiring diagram as it relates to AT&L and breaking that up. So yes, McCain has shown a propensity to be active, but it'll be interesting to see to what extent are they going to try a whole nother tranche of activity, or will it be a more toned down approach and just try to clean up some of the issues and do more of a let's wait to see how the department comes back on how they think the wiring diagram should look. And that has not come over from the department yet. It, I believe, is anticipated to come over in the not too distant future, and it is expected to come over, at least expected before an actual NDAA happens. But I think that will have a lot of influence on how Congress responds, right? Mm-hmm. I think the third issue will be, what does the 809 panel come out with? Because the 809 panel was established by Congress in the FY16 National Defense Authorization Act, and it's supposed to take a 2-year look at the regulations and, to some extent, the statutes that govern defense acquisition, and even some of the internal policies of the Department of Defense. And the idea is to put a 2-year research effort on it. Now, the panel really only got started January of this year, so they've only been operating on a functional level for about 4 months. But for those of you that haven't seen, they put out their interim report yesterday, and there was a hearing yesterday on that before the House Armed Services Committee. So that will be particularly interesting to see, and I actually am looking forward to see what the panel actually says in the next year and a half. But I do believe that the Armed Services Committee will have an appetite, and Thornberry did indicate this, Chairman Thornberry, to see what the panel does and give them some time to try to develop recommendations and propose those recommendations. So there might be some breathing room and a slight pause in the activism, maybe, as some would say, a calm before the storm, to see what the panel does.
Do you think, just pulling that panel thread a little more, if those recommendations were accepted, essentially, what NDAA would we see those in? When would we kind of see that come out in policy?
Right. So much of it is a work in progress. I think the plan is to try to have something, although not a final report by any stretch, to hit perhaps not this year's NDAA, right? The following year's NDAA. So we're talking about 19, and a final report that would be issued that would be much more comprehensive for the following year, which I believe would be 20, right? The 20 NDA. So I think that's where the bulk of the work will going to be. But the idea is to kind of follow the construct of the 800 panel, which led to the Federal Acquisition Streamlining Act of 1994, which is, and if you get a chance, let me highly recommend take a look at it, because you'll see what the panel is looking to do. On their website, they have not only the interim report, but they have a supplemental. And what the supplemental does is it says there are 5 case studies that we mentioned in the interim report. Now let's show you how we will attack problems that we see. And it's a red line, right? So what they do is, one example is, and this is going to the point of what to expect from the panel. There's one example of DLA, based on a 1956 law, has been buying tanks and fuel distribution for 20 years, right? 5-year base and 3 5-year option years for 20 years. Now, since 1956, the tanks now have double hulls. The EPA laws have changed. The technology is there to detect leaks, so the typical industry warranty on these things is 30 years. So the proposal of the panel was, well, let's change the law to extend from 20-year buys to 30-year buys. And then if you look at the supplemental, you'll see that there's an actual red line in implementing language of how you would do that in statute. The idea being staffers can just pull out a page, drop it into the NDAA, and there's about a 2-page write-up that goes into the history of EPA, what DLA says about it, where the statute came from, and what impact it has, and a rough order of magnitude potential cost savings that this could have over 20 years annually. And that's the idea, to have analysis that's proposing red lines behind it. But the only thing I want to add, though, is the panel is not aiming everything at statute. That is only one aspect of what the panel is doing. So even in the supplement, there are recommendations that are aimed at legislation. There are recommendations that are aimed specifically at regulation, like the federal acquisition regulation without statute. And there's a recommendation that's related to an executive order, which is the basis or the underlying basis for current policy. So the goal of the panel is to not cast a stone, but to look broadly at whatever the regulation is, and whatever the source is, we'll make an actual red line proposal to change it. Does that answer the question?
Andy, did you want to add anything about what you're looking for in the 809 panel? Or?
No, I think we're just kind of looking to get more detail on what they're going to be recommending.
Me too.
There was some concerning testimony yesterday about reducing competition and reducing small business participation, which, depending on what policy goals the department wants to advance. I think that Shea Assad is correct in what he said this morning, that a lot of our greatest innovation does come from small businesses, and so we want to make sure that they can have access, and that the department can take advantage of their innovation.
Right. And then if we could turn to Representative Thornberry's bill for a moment, there's quite a bit of interesting language in there, things about intellectual property, technical data, about services contracting. What jumped out at you? Are there things that you say you support, or that you want to learn more about, things that are concerning?
So one, we have to look at, or I haven't had a chance to actually look at the bill itself, so I'm just kind of going off of press reports and press releases right now. But we are excited to see that service contracting is part of the agenda. that's more of what the department buys at this point than in goods, and that really needs to be part of a strategy for how do we make sure we have the most cost-effective workforce. I'm curious to learn more about some of the commercial buying opportunities. On the one hand, it's great for the department to be able to access that stuff directly, but one of the things that was mentioned is problems with the GSA schedule, which is the General Services Administration kind of pre-negotiating some of these commercial contracts. When POGO did an investigation into Hurricane Katrina contracting, we found that in many instances, people didn't take advantage of pre-negotiated prices under those schedules that could have had significant cost savings. So leasing for cars that 2 or 3 times more than what would have been the pre-negotiated rate. And then we just have some concerns about further weakening the Defense Contract Audit Agency.
So the panel really hasn't had a chance to in detail look at the proposal, so I really can't comment intelligently on it, and I'll hope that stops me from commenting at all.
Then let's move to the budget. Certainly, I think that is of interest to all contractors. How do you see kind of the process playing out this year? Obviously, we're waiting for President's budget to come out, and then we'll undergo the process. But certainly, there seems like there's a lot going on the Hill and in the administration. I wonder how you think that might impact the process this year.
It's going to be interesting. So for a number of years, Congress has not been able to really pass appropriations, and that has created certain issues for both the contractor community and the Department of Defense. The political situation on Capitol Hill and in Washington kind of changes every day, so it'll be interesting to see if they can come together for negotiations to agree on whether they want a new budget deal or not. So what the top line is going to be, what the priorities are going to be. So far, it looks like the budget is going to look pretty similar to what we saw under the Obama administration, continuing to see the overseas contingency operations account used as kind of a release valve for different department priorities.
So for the past, I think, 54 years, the Armed Services Committee leading the effort has passed a National Defense Authorization Act. Not always exactly on time by September 30th, but not 9 months later. Right? From a strictly defense acquisition perspective, it would be useful for the department as well as the workforce that has to execute acquisitions if that same 54-year record of implementing an NDAA, if not on time, pretty close to on time or close-ish to on time, was mirrored by budgets, because it is just impossible. It's hard enough to plan with our current budget process if everything is working great. It's virtually impossible to plan when even the current process isn't being followed.
And while that's true on the one hand, one would also hope that the Department of Defense would kind of learn what the political situation is and start adjusting and planning as if there is going to be a CR, since that's probably going to be what it is. We think that the department probably inflicts more pain than is necessary through poor planning.
No, what fun is that? No.
Then you don't get more money.
I'm not going to disagree.
I mean, certainly, I wonder also, there seems to be a hope on the Hill that the Trump administration's focus on building up defense plays out in budgets, but so far, it sounds like you think that what we're actually going to see is going to hew more closely to kind of what we've seen in the past. Is that fair?
I think so far that seems to be the case, particularly with the Budget Control Act still in place, still some of the same dynamics that you see in the Republican caucus between the Freedom Caucus and others, and just an inability to kind of get not just a defense top line agreement, but overall budget agreement, and how do we have the best priorities.
But I think one of the interesting things about budget is, with all of that said, how does DoD take the budget that they have or eventually get and allocate those resources, right? Because that could have a tremendous impact on the effectiveness, right? So, for example, there are many instances where DoD, for good budgetary reasons or acquisition reasons, will extend the buy of a program, right? But that could have multi-billion-dollar consequences. So one question perhaps that Andrew will answer is, how do we do that, Andrew? No, I'm sorry, let me finish the point. One of the questions is, to what extent would a more effective internal budgeting process within the Department of Defense, which was more closely linked and married to requirements and acquisitions, have an effect, right? Because one way to have more purchasing power for the Department of Defense is just raise the top line, right? Another one might be more effectively allocating the resource that you have. And in some cases, that could be almost as much or more effective than just more dollars. So I think that's something to think about from a budget perspective. Let's think about how are we using the money that the department has.
Right. Welcome, Andrew. I just want to take a minute and introduce Andrew Hunter, who's Senior Fellow in the International Security Program and Director of the Defense Industrial Initiatives Group at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Previously served as a Senior Executive in DoD, was Director of the Joint Rapid Acquisition Cell. He also was Chief of Staff to Ash Carter and Frank Kendall when they were the top Pentagon acquisition officials, and also served in a variety of roles in the House, including as a professional staff member of the House Armed Services Committee. Andrew, one of the first questions that we went through was sort of, what are you watching this year? And I wondered if you could kind of take us through the issues that you expect Congress to take up that will affect defense contractors this year.
Well, thank you. I apologize for arriving in an untimely fashion, but I'm glad that I'm here to join you and to join this panel, because it's a great group. And I just want to start by commending Moshe on behalf of the 809 panel, because I think the interim report they put out is really spectacular. I'm a big fan, and I look forward to seeing the rest of their work. And I do think this is going to have is already going to begin to influence the process this year, even though I know they have more time to deliver their full wisdom to the Congress and to the government as a whole on how to take on the pretty ambitious task that they set out, which I think is absolutely the right task. Obviously, with the introduction of Congressman Thornberry's bill today, tomorrow, at some point in the near future, that's certainly going to drive the conversation on the House side. I think the focus on services contracting is actually, well, frankly, it's overdue. In the mists of the past, the often overlooked Acquisition Improvement Act of 2010, which was the product of a prior leadership on the House Armed Services Committee that looked at acquisition, had a focus on services contracting. It was kind of a complement to the Weapons Systems Acquisition Reform Act, immediately followed it, and really focused on the issue of how to establish requirements for services contracts, how to get the right statements of work, how to set requirements, who would be involved in that process. It had ambitious goals, not all of which were fully realized, although the one thing I always like to point out to folks is that initiatives to make big changes at DoD should not be expected to deliver results overnight. And so, in fact, I kind of view the issuance of the supplement to 5,000 for services contracting, which just came out last year, as one of the logical outgrowths of the work that Congress did on services contracting in 2010. So that's a 7-year fuse. That's a bit of a long one, longer, I think, than was anticipated at the time. But I do think that it is appropriate to have a focus on services contracting. It is a huge share of the budget, as the committee points out. At CSIS, we break out research and development from other kinds of services contracts, which gives us our numbers as we look at services contracting are a slightly different set than the ones you see according to the classic DoD division, which includes R&D in the services category. But nonetheless, you see some pretty interesting trends in services, and services have actually done quite well in the budget process, if you want to call it that, even though they aren't specifically budgeted, in the last several years. I suspect that's because the department needs those services. I think given the budget pressures the department's been under over the last 5 years, it cannot be accidental or simply an oversight that these services have fared well, particularly in competition with research and development, and with, to some extent, with products in a very tough budget environment. But I think absolutely the focus on that, and why is that the case? Why are these services so important and so valuable to the department that they are being prioritized over other kinds of contract spending? That absolutely merits a tough look and to understand the causes of that. Now, it marries up, I think, in an interesting way with the work that the panel has been doing, because one of their top-level findings is that the world is changing, industry is changing, and so maybe it's not all that surprising that the structure of how contract spending is being done is going to change as well. Hopefully it will change along with those broader trends, should change along with those broader trends. And so I'm tempted to think, but I want to wait for more data because that's my tendency as an analyst, that these things are related and that the interest in services is being driven by the changing nature of the economy.
The Department of Defense did its own chart a couple of years ago looking at the composition of its workforce, looking at the costs of civilians, the costs of military personnel, and costs of service contractors. And they identified that service contracting is really where the cost savings opportunities were. So I'm glad that Congress is looking into that more closely.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is about services is certainly we've had this conversation before, but that number seems to just go up, that figure, and I wonder, they seem sort of, bulletproof. Do you think that something might actually change in terms of us seeing lower spending on services?
I'll jump in. So just some data points. One is it depends what we're doing operationally around the world. So if you actually look at, based on FPDS, so understanding the challenges with that data, if you look at FPDS data, the percentage of contracting that took place in Afghanistan and Iraq that was service-oriented was substantially higher than the typical defense spending. So if we are in large-scale operations, you will see an increase in the percentage of spending generally, particularly in that area. So that's number one. Number two is it is so much harder to define the difference between services and R&D and goods today, because when you buy an iPhone, or the F-35 might be an even better example, well, how much of that is software and how are you breaking it down? So we're all working off of FPDS data, and FPDS rules are, if it's more than 50%, that's how you categorize it, right? So if you're spending 51% on a $2 billion product and you determine 51% of it is a good, well, that's all goods dollars. If someone else the next day might look at it and go, well, that's really 51% services, that changes the entire thing. So that's the second. And the third point I'd make is if you compare DOD, there's some feedback here. Maybe it's just me. If you compare DOD to a lot of other agencies tend to have a higher percentage of spending on services. USAID is an obvious one. Mm-hmm. Part of that is because, fortunately, USAID isn't buying F-35s or carriers. But so all of these trends do make it really hard to determine exactly what that means. But we're not going back to just goods.
I've kind of already said this, but I actually do not expect a focus on services to lead to a decline in services contract spending. If the last 5 years, where we've had a huge budget drawdown and where there's actually been focused effort by each of the services, although each of them to varying degrees and with different methodologies, but there's been a focused method by all of them to specifically target services contracts for reduction. And yet we still don't see large reductions in services contracts. That tells me that there is a reason. I don't think it's, there's lots that we can look at the acquisition system and say things happen maybe for not the right reason or for the wrong reason, but I don't think something that fundamental that's gotten that much focus could be this resilient unless there was an underlying value that was being served. Now, are we paying the right amount for services contractors? Are we getting the best value for dollar on the services side? I think that's a separate question than the value of the services themselves. Of course, if you go talk to the services contracting industry, what you will hear, I'm going to choose my words carefully, but I will say endlessly, is that the trend in the services contract industry is a race to the bottom and it's all LPTA, and in fact that the department has put tremendous effort in reducing the cost per person hour, per work hour, and through mechanisms like LPTA has done that to its own detriment. And again, it's a very hard question to analyze as an analyst because we don't have good data that says even that a certain contract is an LPTA contract. It's a bit of a subjective question. I'm reminded of the old joke about the Supreme Court definition of pornography. LPTI is a little bit like that. You know it when you see it in the source selection. It doesn't say on its face, this is what I am. So it's a really hard question to analyze. But obviously, from industry, the feedback has been, actually our rates are under siege in the contracting process. Now, that may be more true in some areas than others.
Right.
But here's the other question Here's the other question is, how much of what we spend on services is tied up to end strength, right? And how much of work that 20, 30, 40 years ago was done by people in uniform are now being outsourced? And that's a direct relation to how much is going to be acquired in services too now.
Right. Maybe shift gears for a moment, and I wanted to talk about DIUX and third offset, which were some initiatives put in place by the Obama administration in the building. We don't quite know yet what the Trump administration thinks of that, but I wondered if you could comment on where you think Congress would fall on trying to preserve or foster, or maybe set up their own initiatives with similar goals, depending on what happens with the building.
Well, I guess I've got a confirmed view on this position, which I will reiterate and try to expand on a little bit. I do think the third offset terminology has not been widely embraced. Literally the words used to describe it. But I think a lot of the ideas have started to really take hold. And I think they've taken hold in different ways in the service leadership, and not uniformly across all the services. But I think the services, each of them in their own way, have found a way to interpret some of the concepts of the third offset consistent with their objectives. And so I would argue that, in fact, to an important extent, the services have embraced many of the concepts of the third offset strategy. I expect the terminology to shift and kind of be reimagined in the mold of the new administration, and I think perhaps pointedly in this case in the mold of Jim Mattis, when he's ready and when he can attach it to a broader national strategy that's been approved from the administration, and not necessarily get out ahead of that, although there may be some utility from his perspective in getting a little bit out ahead of it in true Marine fashion. And I also see that it's had an impact in the Congress. I think a lot of the push towards dividing the responsibilities of AT&L in last year's legislation to put the focus on innovation, it was not only consistent with third offset, I think it was explicitly linked in the minds of some of the people pushing those proposals in exactly that way. So I think in the broad outlines, there's been quite a bit of an embrace of that that should carry over into the next administration.
Yeah.
I don't have anything on third offset. I just know with DIUX, there's kind of, I think some people are excited about it. Some people see it as just a symptom of kind of a larger failed acquisition system that you have to keep on creating these little new pet projects. So it kind of remains to be seen so far what that's going to achieve and whether that's really going to be bringing new vendors into work with the Department of Defense and new talent.
So perhaps a few words and perhaps slightly a little bit more broadly on technology, not limiting it to that. And one of the findings of the panel is the United States, for a significant time, rightfully believed that they enjoyed a technological advantage. Right? We're a unipower. That technological advantage is eroding. Simple, period, stop. That is what we heard from the services, military services, service acquisitions. That's what we heard from the services, that's what we heard from companies, and that's what we heard from other countries, right? People in the field who were in the field recently who said, we are losing our technological dominance, we are seeing that erode. And there are a number of factors there, some in the control of the United States, and I say that writ large because it's not just the Department of Defense, this is a policy and government-wide issue and acquisition and all of that, and some of it beyond the control of the United States. So some of the things that are beyond the control of the United States is the United States and the Department of Defense specifically does not drive the R&D or markets the way they used to. Some of that is not necessarily because DoD has been spending money, but the rest of the world has been catching up, right? Other economies have taken off. Just look at what China's economy has done in growth over the last 20 years. You look at Saudi Arabia's military budget over the last 20 years. So some of that is perhaps inevitable when the United States does not have such a dominant economic benefit globally, economically. Part of it is because industry has become such a leader. So even if, and this is accurate, DoD has been spending more money on R&D, the private industry around the world, as well as in the United States, has increased even faster as they have had more capital. That doesn't mean DoD isn't a major player. They are absolutely a major player, but they don't dominate the way they used to. One of the consequences of that, particularly with R&D being so much in the commercial market, is that new technologies are cheaper, more ubiquitous, and accessible by other countries, right? And that is a real challenge. Add to that how quickly technology and innovation is adapting, right? So you could have a system and software today, and a week later, they're pushing out another update. It's evolving so rapidly, it's really hard to maintain that critical growth. So the technological issue is a huge challenge. And I'll just add one other point to that. It's not just about having the most cutting edge and advanced technology. It's about incorporating that technology into operational plans and organizational constructs. Or in other words, how do you use that technology and integrate with it? And as technology gets, ironically, more advanced and develops faster, it sometimes takes even longer to integrate that technology into platforms, F-35 being one example.
Okay. I think this discussion leads naturally to a discussion of commerciality, competitive bidding, and I wondered, that's come up in the Thornberry bill, certainly in 809. I wonder if you have a broader sense of what the HAS, the SAS thinks of these kinds of things, and if we're going to see more beyond what is already out there.
At least with Chairman Thornberry, we've really seen him kind of take the perspective of industry and really trying to broaden the definition of commercial. Shea Assad and others at the Department of Defense had tried to kind of narrow that definition to truly be reflective of what is truly a commercial good, but that largely got defeated in the House. And we haven't seen quite as much of the emphasis on competition coming out of the House as we have. That was really a centerpiece of Senator McCain and Senator Levin's Weapons Systems Acquisition Reform Act to really try and prioritize real, genuine competition.
I could probably talk for the next hour on this topic. I will try to avoid doing that. And I should be clear that I think there's a lot of, there's a lot to be said for a variety of perspectives here. I think we tend to start to talk about commercial, and then we sometimes end up talking about commercial item. And I think those are not the same thing. When in Moshe's report, as I read it, when he's talking about the rise of commercial, a lot of what's being described, and I know you didn't solely write it, but I know you had a lot to do with writing it, is not things that would necessarily qualify as commercial items under a government legal definition of what's a commercial item. But they are commercial in an important respect, and that the genesis of the requirement is coming not from government, not from DoD, certainly, but from broader economic impulses, and in many cases, global demand for those items. And so at that level, I think it is unquestionably true that we need to be prepared to buy commercial technology and commercial services that may or may not be mostly technological in their basis. And we need to be able to do that better than we do today. We need to have in government more expertise on doing that. We may need, I think we do need some business models for how to go about doing that may differ from the ones that have been traditional under the FAR and in the budget process. And of course, we need a lot of skill in how to price that, which obviously is where Shea's expertise comes in very strongly. Having said that, there is something to be said for this commercial item definition too. I can sometimes talk out of both sides of my mouth on this. We did a report about a month and a half ago on the rise of space, and then it was really hard to talk about commercial, even though I was trying to talk about commercial space, because government and commercial and space are entirely intertwined from alpha to omega. There is no clean separation between the two. So in that context, it was actually easier for me to use a definition that was more like a commercial item definition recognizing that I couldn't really talk about something that was wholly a commercial technology because almost all space technology has its basis at some point in government funding, even the stuff that we now think of as being private.
I don't really have much to add. The only thing I would mention, 2 small points based on competition. One is it is a really hard balancing act, right, to find that, because on one hand, competition is really good. So I can tell you personally, at our house, I've adopted this mantra whenever we need someone to cut down a tree or try to redo a kitchen, although that's not going to happen because I work for government, or anything else. It's like, no, I need 3 bids, and I got to tell you how much money that is saved. On the other hand, sometimes you know what the answer is, and how do you do that is really hard. So I guess I would just quote David Packard, who knew something about the private sector. In his 1986 report, he wrote, "Competition for competition's sake makes no sense." And I think no matter what regulations you write, at the end of the day, it's how it's interpreted by the people, because there's good competition, there's bad lip service competition, and on some level, there's just no way to regulate that. Which gets me to my very small, quick second point is, much of this, no matter how you define commercial items or all that, is about the workforce.
If I could, I'm sorry, guys.
No, please.
You know,
Please.
it's silent back here. Just one point on that for the general public, which may not understand. In the terms of competition and commercial, there's a big issue on the table. And Shehzad alluded to that earlier today. And that is that if there really is competition inside of what we're procuring as commercial, we don't care. We understand that those items will depress their costs to us to a value that they know they can compete and win. When the commerciality becomes important is when we're in a sole source vendor locked situation, and when we care about understanding the value to what we want to have procured. That's an important nuance, right? Because there is, even though we're balancing, and this is a discussion about risk to national security versus public good, there is a need to be able to stretch our national security funds as far as they can reach, because the cost of complex items and the pressures of our adversaries have pushed us into an arena that we do watch every penny as we spend it. And all of us, nonpartisan, are out to make sure that we can get the best deal for our public. But that's where this risk lies. And I think Shay said it, and both Moshe and Andrew said it. We have to take a look through a lens to understand what's most important to us when we make those deliberative decisions. It cannot be a uniform decision, because anytime we try to carte blanche paint one color, we find an exception to the rule that we need to manage or mitigate. I just want to put that on the table, because it's hard for everybody to understand commercial when it comes to what the government's business is in this area.
Thank you. I think that's as good a time as any to open it up for questions. Anyone? Teddy, you want to ask a question?
So you mentioned that it becomes a question of the workforce. I was wondering if you could talk more about that. Are we talking about sort of contracting officers, or which part of the workforce, and like what kind of what differentiates them, and how do you put them in a position to make the right decisions? Or if it is about the workforce, what can be improved about helping the workforce do a better job?
I think everybody's going to have comments on that if I'm wrong, but I'll take the first stab at it, I guess, because I was foolish enough to raise the issue. A lot can be improved, right? And that is not a critique of the people, that's a critique of the entire system. So let me give you a couple of examples, and I'll just use the mention. I'll start with the example that Andrew mentioned. So if you have a policy in a particular contracting office or a branch in a contracting shop that says, we will do this lowest price technically acceptable. What you're doing is you are applying a uniform process, and you are taking out of the hands of the individuals any judgment. Now, you could say that's a good thing because you don't trust the workforce. You can say that's a bad thing because they don't have any discretion. But it's not always clear what the best value is, if it's just on price or not. So I think one of the issues, and this is a philosophical debate, is to what extent do you empower people at what level to make decisions, right? And there is a tendency in the department in some places and in Congress in some places that when something goes wrong, you regulate it, or you legislate it, or you pass a policy on it. Now, this is an example I would give. So many of you I'm sure are familiar with the concept of breakage. So if a Walmart or Sam's Club has a carton of eggs and a worker drops it, they've lost about, 59 cents for the carton. Okay, so you deal with it. In DOD, if you drop a carton of eggs, 59 cents, you'll say, well, wait a second, that's not a good thing. So let's spend a couple $1 million to build an egg carton that you can drop that won't break, right? Well, that's not cost effective, but sometimes the specter of those little costs trigger a response that might be overkill that also ends up taking discretion out, which leads to other bad decisions. Does that make sense? And I'll just give one other example, is in the report we have an example of how in an actual program, and we got it from the program office, it took longer to approve the acquisition strategy documents than to actually write them, right?
That's got to be universally true.
I could say much about that, but so I do work for CRS, and I'll tell you, it generally does not take them longer to review what I write than when I actually write it. So we have 18 commissioners on this panel, and trust me, in many respects, that could be extremely painful. It did not take them that long to review this, right? So I don't need to say more about, but those are problems with the workforce. The regulations don't empower them all the time. Sometimes they are not put into positions to succeed, and the review process sometimes are more than necessary. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let me spend a little bit of time on this idea of what is the acquisition workforce, and is it a fully useful concept? And you have to kind of recall that the statutory definition of the acquisition workforce originally developed as a way to identify who would need the training under DWIA and other things, but which was almost immediately became a political issue about downsizing the workforce because they were shoppers, and Congress went through a period where it felt like they wanted fewer shoppers than Marines, and you still hear that from time to time. And so you had this arbitrary limit, and anyone who was in the category of the acquisition workforce became suddenly vulnerable to having their job cut, which is going to have some perverse impacts on whether people want to be identified as part of the acquisition workforce or not. So leave aside the official definition of the acquisition workforce and think about who's actually involved in a given acquisition. And I think it's true for all of them, but it's particularly true for services contracting, that a lot of the people involved aren't considered to be part of the acquisition workforce. So the person who's deciding what's actually required, what work is actually required, is almost never going to be formally a member of the acquisition workforce. They're never going to have perhaps gone to a DAU course. They're not going to have read the FAR. All of this is not expertise they have, but they do have some expertise on what the need of the base is that they're trying to acquire a service to fulfill or to meet some other service category. So part of it is that I think we've gotten a little overly bureaucratic in our definition of who is involved in these activities and what their skill sets have to be to do their job. And so I think the thing is, there's probably millions of personnel at DoD who need to understand more about how to acquire commercial technologies, commercial services, and commercial goods in order for the government to get the best value out of the acquisition process. And I think we've got to think about it more broadly. What we learned when we got into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the phrase that came out of that was contracting as commander's business. It wasn't the acquisition workforce's business to make sure that we didn't have contracting run amok in theater. It was the commander's business to make sure, because that was the only way that you could effectively engage in that. And so I think we have to change our mindset a little bit about where these skills are required in the workforce, because at some level the answer is everywhere.
Yeah, and all I would say is, some of it comes down to leadership, a lot of it comes down to having discipline. The 809 panel report also raises important things just about the context of how much we people across the aisle criticize the civilian workforce, and that's makes it so that some of these people are almost being successful despite the political environment around them, when decisions are being made based on politics rather than what actually the performance is of systems. It depends on kind of what kind of acquisition we're talking about, but making sure that we have people who can find the independent information that they need to make good decisions and are empowered to do so.
Can I ask it a slightly different way? So it seems like there's like two different types of people in the workforce. There's like the Shea Assads who are really gung-ho and focused on value, and then there's sort of more industry-friendly people who are sort of presenting the industry view. That's just maybe an overgeneralization, but to the extent, can you give us a sense of like which are the type of people who are in charge of making these decisions? Are they more like a Shea Assad, or are they more like an industry person? And is it going in one direction or another moving forward?
So I don't know if it's necessarily whether someone is a Shea Assad or an industry person, but it's who do they think that they're working for, and what is. So we become very concerned about problems with the revolving door and wondering if people are kind of pulling their punches as they're thinking about what their next job is going to be instead of really focusing on what they're doing right now. But under the regulatory environment and just the general kind of culture of the Pentagon, I think it's more not even necessarily being pro-industry so much as being risk-averse, and that sometimes industry is just a more active stakeholder in pushing back than the soldier down the line who's going to end up having that weapon system.
And perhaps there's a third group of people, which is the people who are actually making the decisions on the ground, because most of the acquisition decisions happen there, right? So, and I'll give you two stories, and this is, I think, where I perhaps wasn't illustrating as well as I should have. So I remember right after Katrina going down to Mississippi. It was about a month afterwards, and I was talking to a whole bunch of contracting officers working for FEMA, as well as I believe the Army Corps of Engineers was there. And they were working on the blue tarp program, which is the blue tarps that you put on over roofs when the roofs have holes or blew off, and they also doing the debris cleanup as well as the trailers. And one of the contracting officers said, look, tell me what you want. Do you want small business? I'll do small business from today till tomorrow. Do you want best price? I'll get you best price from today to tomorrow. Do you want value? I can give you value from today to tomorrow. The problem is when I do small business, you beat me up on price. When I do price, you beat me up on value. When I do value, you beat me up on small business. Tell me what you want. Now, sometimes they align, but sometimes they don't, and the message that we're sending is really hard to react to. And we're not always setting up the people who are really making the decisions to succeed. I will give you just two more very quick examples. One is, you mentioned Iraq and Afghanistan, right? I think that is a perfect example because you will have contracting officers or COTARs, contracting officer representatives, or CORs, depending on which service you're in, obviously, right? Rolling in for 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year, depending on the rotation, depending on their service. Now, how many of you had to find a doctor like a dentist? Everybody should be raising their hand, I'm assuming, right? Or something, right? How hard is it to do research to figure out who's really good? Very hard. It's hard. Now imagine you're going to a foreign country where you don't speak the language, where they shoot at you, right? And you don't know who the contractors are. They don't have a Better Business Bureau. They really don't have any of those consumer reports. And you've got to find out the best contractor. And you're only there for 6 months, and someone else is going to come in 6 months later, and someone else is going to come in 6 months later. How are you possibly going to succeed and know who to hire in that case? I mean, it is really hard. So contracting officers are handing things out, handing things over to each other, and the contractors who have been there for 10 years, they know what's going on. The local population that's been there even longer, they know what's going on. Who are the people that have the least information? The people have to make the contracting decisions and will have to live with the consequence of those contracting decisions if it's like a base support or some other contract supporting basis. How do you succeed? I mean, that's not really setting them up to succeed. Now, how do you solve that? I have no idea. But those are some of the challenges that we have. And then the last point I'll make is, I don't know who's in charge half the time, right? Because if you're a program manager, you don't necessarily control your budget, you don't necessarily control your requirements, you don't necessarily control the people you're hiring or can hire or who gets given to you to run the program, but you're responsible for everything. So I'm not always sure who's in charge of all the decisions or actual execution. I'll stop.
Yeah, let me weigh in on this. And you know, to your credit, you said this may be an overgeneralization. I'm not a huge fan of that division of folks. I mean, I think you have to keep in mind that a truly successful contract is going to be profitable for industry, and it's going to meet the government's needs affordably. So we reach success when it's a win-win. Sorry to use tired terminology, but ultimately it's the aligning of interests that we're looking for. So I don't think we want someone who's anti-industry leading the government effort, because we do want industry to win, in essence, under the contract. It's not a zero-sum game, I guess is what I'm getting at. Now, having said that, I think obviously the government has to approach every dialogue with industry as a skeptic. And I kind of had this aha moment very early in my congressional career when I got sucked into a conversation about radars for missile defense. And you had an industry team from one contractor come in and say, only radars operating in this frequency can possibly do the missile defense mission that is required. In this case, it was a Navy mission. And contractor, team from the other contractor comes in and says, only this radars in this completely separate and different frequency band can possibly do the mission that the Navy requires. And I actually I was recently out of college, actually went to college with some smart people who did signal processing. And I said, can you help me with this? Which of them is right? He said, well, it depends. There is no one answer. They're both, in essence, lying to some extent. Both can put together a pretty reasonable proposal, and an intelligent buyer, can distinguish between them. So I do think, and I'm not saying that industry routinely lies, but they're out there representing their particular interest. But it's not necessarily government versus industry. But I do think the government has to be a very skeptical buyer and a very knowledgeable buyer when it can. And as Moshe has pointed out, we don't have that luxury in many instances, particularly in overseas operations.
Another question? Any other questions? Oh, go ahead.
To refer to the comment that was made from the floor earlier about the nuance and drawing a distinction when there's a sole source situation that's involved, what is preventing you? I mean, obviously you want to put in place solutions that can scale and are, you're able to execute on them. What prevents you from a situation where, let's say there's a company that at some threshold, maybe they provide you more than $100 million worth of sole source products. What prevents you from saying, for that company as a whole, sole source and not, once a year, annually, you tell us your numbers on what you sell to us as a government or the Department of Defense. So if you're making 40% off of us, we get to see that, and next year, you know what, we're going to negotiate a little bit harder or a lot harder. What prevents you from doing that? Seems to me that for your top 50 suppliers, that would be a relatively easy ask. Second question is, to what extent in coming up with your new strategies for procurement have you studied the latest innovations in the commercial market, the private marketplace? There's a wave of newer strategy that's being done in the biggest companies in the world based on zero-based budgeting and various principles associated with that aren't directly applicable, but certainly there's some best practices that can be gained from that I think are, I'm interested as to whether you're applying those or not in the panel recommendations, the commission recommendations.
I think the first question's really more for you, right?
Well, I think there is always a space, as I said, for being an educated customer. And if we identify that someone is a supplier that is, critical or reaches a certain mass, and we want more information from them, it makes sense to go get it. Having said that, you have to keep in mind that the government, U.S. Department of Defense alone, has millions of vendors. So if you talk about the top 50, right, I mean, you've covered, Boeing down to, other Fortune 100 companies. You haven't gone any lower than that because basically they're all in there.
You choose a number, but it would be an amount that would cover, 50% of the spend is probably 100 companies, is what I would guess. And there's a certain proportion of those that are making a lot more than 6 to 15% off of you.
Well, except if you look at the financials of those companies and understanding that there is some financial ledger domain that is always possible, even under regular accounting principles, we can go and look up all their SEC filings and see what their rate of profit on government business is.
But they don't disclose it for the military.
Well, I would say that, depends on which one you're talking about, right? Lockheed, we've got pretty good insight.
You're arguing that no one's, you're saying it's not necessary. What I'm saying
it's complex.
Well, is it?
It's complex and overwhelming if you're trying to do it for, so break it down maybe by market sector, okay? Because the different market sectors are very different. You're quickly going to get into numbers of many thousands of firms that you're going to ask them to break out, which they may not have the data, if they aren't required to maintain it under cost accounting. And so if they're under cost accounting, they are doing this already. If they're not under cost accounting, they're probably not even gathering that data.
But what I'm observing is people are saying, well, they should provide us with costs, right, at the part level, which is infinitely more complicated, or they should provide us with commerciality, justification that these are the prices they offer the commercial sector at the part level, infinitely more complicated. What I'm saying is just take it way up a level. Forget all that and take it way up and say, how much are you making off of us for the top tier? I mean, what I'm proposing is a lot simpler than what is purported to be executed now. And the reason I'm asking is because I've seen numbers of companies that are making multiples of what you guys think they're making off of you. Multiples. And they're using that to subsidize their other parts of their business. And so why can't we do something straightforward like that?
I think we could.
Where you have sole source.
Something that we've been interested in is restanding up a renegotiation board to do those kinds of efforts. Not popular with industry, but is one possibility. For some of these sole source things, as you kind of acknowledged, there are certain restraints when it's designated a commercial item to getting that kind of pricing information. We've seen the Department of Defense Inspector General use subpoena power to get some of that information. We do have some concerns where the public isn't allowed to see that information, but anyone who's willing to buy proprietary systems can look at that kind of pricing information and can kind of make those same determinations. So I think there are some opportunities to do that. But again, part of it is some of those audit agencies that would do that work are being underfunded and undermined.
Well, and there are a number of contracts that there is a lot of visibility into it, like cost contracts. So there are a number of cost type contracts that are sole source. And you will have a very good idea when you see those numbers, what they are. That's not all the contracts, but that's some of them. And then there are some instances where there are some companies will be like, we don't want to give you that information, because that's a competitive advantage. We don't want anybody to know what we're making, and in some cases, not our problem. You're not our biggest client. It's interesting that DOD, in the handgun acquisition they made, they're not the biggest buyers. I mean, they might be the individual big buyer, but they're not moving that market. They are not 50% of the small arms market, right? I think it was Ruger. There was at least one company that just didn't feel like competing because it's like, we're not interested. We're doing very good, thank you. And that's with some weapons, right? So there are a lot of issues, and I agree, there are some cases where DOD is, I think I'm pretty safe to say, overpaying, in some cases even substantially over what they should be. But there are other cases where we do have visibility because it's a cost contract. There are other cases where they're just not going to give it to us and then you have to make a decision.
So you're arguing for the status quo?
No, I am not. If I was arguing for the status quo, I would not be on this 809 panel.
I would just add that if you go to industry and say, tell us what you're making off us, it's not, I would argue, meaningful unless you have a way to check it. So how do you check it? Well, then you have to ask for that piece part cost data to check their homework, because they can give you any number they want. If you just say, give us the corporate total, what your margin is on our business, you're going to find out it's right in line with what the profit guidance says it should be. And then you got to figure out, is that true or not? And then you got to go in with auditors and do the homework. So I'm not sure you get away from the complexity problem, is what I'm saying.
Thanks.